Omicron Parthenikinae diasas totokosum, Techiras to Simeon eυλογήσας ως έπρεπε.
Hello, everyone. In this coming Sunday's Gospel reading from Luke 13, we read the following. At that time, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called her and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your infirmity." And he laid his hands upon her, and immediately she was made straight, and she praised God. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." Then the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" As he said this, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him. Several things that are important for the Gospel according to Luke come up in this passage. The first of them is that we have to recognize that this section of the Gospel of Luke, chapters 9 to 19, are Jesus's exodus to Jerusalem. In the Transfiguration in the Gospel of Luke, we read, "Behold, 2 men talked with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory, and spoke of his departure, his exodus, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem." And then from that point forward after the Transfiguration, through chapters 9 to 19, Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem. And like Moses before him, he is leading his people. And there are really 3 types of figures whom Jesus deals with in this section from chapters 9 to 19 when he is making his way to Jerusalem in his exodus. First, let me say that it's in these sections, this section of Luke, that that we see the most characteristically Lucan material. And that means that here is where we see the parable of the prodigal son, which is only in Luke. And here is where we see the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is only in Luke. But we also see in this section Jesus encountering 3 different people. First, he encounters crowds, and these are people who do not yet believe in him. And to them, he gives a warning, and he's saying to them, you have to make a choice. You cannot stand idly by. Either you choose to follow the Son of Man, or you do not. He says, for instance, in chapter 11, when the crowds were increasing, he began to say, "This generation is an evil generation. It seeks a sign, but no sign shall be given to it except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah became a sign to the men of Nineveh, so will the Son of Man be to this generation." He is telling these people to make a choice. The second group are his disciples. They have made the choice to follow them, and to them, he is giving them guidance about how to follow him. For instance, in chapter 11, we read, "He was praying in a certain place, and when he ceased, one of his disciples said to him, 'Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples.' And he said to them, when you pray, say, 'Father, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come.'" And he teaches them the Lord's Prayer. So to people who are not his disciples, he gives a warning that they have to become his disciples. To those who are his disciples, he is teaching them how to be his disciples. But the third group whom he encounters are his opponents. These are the people with whom Jesus is competing for the souls of the people of Israel. We read about them when Jesus says, "While he was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in and sat at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, 'Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of extortion and wickedness.' One of the lawyers answered him, 'Teacher, In saying this, you reproach us also. And he said, Woe to you lawyers also, for you load men with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. These are the people who are competing with Jesus and are trying to prevent him from teaching the people. And these are the people whom Jesus opposes. And he opposes them for precisely the reason that we see in today's gospel reading. They don't want him to heal on the Sabbath. Here we see him talking to the Pharisees, who talk about him washing before dinner. And this gives us an opportunity to say a word or two about Pharisees. The word Pharisee means those who are set apart, the Perushim, right? The other party that we hear about a lot in the New Testament is the Sadducees. And the Sadducees are the priestly elite. They run the Jerusalem temple, and many of the high priests are drawn from the Sadducees. The Pharisees are not clergy. They're a movement. They could be priests. They could be scribes. They could be many things. But they're a movement more than a particular group like the scribes with a particular skill or like the priests with a particular vocation. Their movement focuses on the exact, the akrives interpretation of the law. And the book of Acts and the historian Josephus both stress that the Pharisees focus on akrivia. St. Paul was a Pharisee, and he says of himself, I am a Jew born at Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated according to the strict manner, kata akrivian, of the law of our fathers. Paul also says later in Acts 26, they have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that according to the strictest party, katatin akrivestatin eresin, of our religion, I have lived as a Pharisee. Josephus describes Pharisees in the same way. Paul himself also says in the letter to the Galatians, something that's also important for the Pharisees, that they adhere to the, quote, traditions of the fathers. He says of Galatians 1:13-14, I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. Ton patrikon mu paradosion. And it's precisely with these traditions of the fathers where Jesus clashes with the Pharisees. He clashes with them over their purity rules concerning food and vessels for food and liquid, purity rules concerning corpses and tombs, the purity of the sanctity of the cult apparatus in the Jerusalem temple, the tithing, the priest shares and duties, the proper observance of the Sabbath and of holy days, and on questions like marriage and divorce. Because the Pharisees don't just follow what is in the law, they add also these, quote, other traditions which make the law even harder to follow. And what they do in the process is place great burdens on people and actually obscure the original meaning or purpose of the law. The Pharisees have a phrase where they build a gate or a fence around the law, where if the law says that something is important for the priests to do, the Pharisees say, no, all of Israel must keep these purity laws. And they bring purity laws and rules that are only set for the priestly group into all of Israel. And in the process, also add these other traditions about purity rules and things like that that are not even in the law, where the idea is they want to do far more than the law requires so that they never break it. And in the process, they become inhumane. And this is why Jesus says to them, quoting the prophets, God says he desires mercy and not sacrifice, right? So his clashes with these groups who are following the obscure rules of the law while being very inhumane are the center of Jesus's clashes with the Pharisees. And in his clash, in this episode where he heals the woman, we read at the conclusion, as he said this, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him. And here we see an example in the ministry of Jesus of a biblical model where the prophets in the Old Testament and now Jesus in the New Testament are competing with people to show the power and the might of God. In 1 Kings 18, we see an episode from the career of Elijah the prophet, where at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And so Elijah uses the power of God to defeat the enemies of God, the prophets of the pagan god Baal. And we see several examples of this in the New Testament. In Acts 8, Simon the magician is beguiling people. And it says, they all gave heed to him from the least to the greatest, saying, this man is that power of God which is called great. And we see in the ministry of St. Paul and in the other apostles, they're competing with these false prophets and these pagan religious figures, right? And in the ministry of St. Paul later in Acts 14, when he's in Lycaonia, it says when Paul and Barnabas went to visit them, it says, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul, because he was the chief speaker, they called Hermes, right? And we see this competition between both Old Testament prophets and pagan gods and the New Testament figures of St. Paul and St. Peter and the other apostles against pagan gods. And then finally, in the ministry of Jesus here, Jesus is competing with the opponents to God's will, the Pharisees and other leaders of Israel, to show them that he is the one who is properly doing the work of God in the world. So there's this competition against God's opponents. And by seeing this competition that Jesus is having during this period of his ministry, we recognize the need to stand up and fight in the competition against God's opponents, not so much in the world around us, although it is there, but especially in our own souls, right? We have the wonderful saying, acquire the spirit of silence and thousands around you will be saved. The battle to win the world for Christ begins in our own heart. Father Mark Sietsema once beautifully said, so many people want the Orthodox faith to become one of the leading religions in America, but the more important and more primary task is to make the Orthodox faith the most important faith in our own hearts. And that's where we have to see the struggle against God's opponents, first and foremost in ourselves. We have a struggle to live the biblical message. We're reading the biblical message, and so often we see biblical interpretation as an exercise in giving a sermon or writing a book or writing a commentary, where we wrestle with ancient history and ancient languages and all sorts of things that are hard to understand. But the real struggle for biblical interpretation is not to say something about the Bible, but to actually live the Bible. When Christ tells us that we have to forgive one another, we have to forgive one another. And that's hard because we get angry with people. And when Christ tells us that we have to resist temptations to anger or lust or greed, we have to resist those temptations. And that's difficult because those temptations can be strong. But we're fighting as Christ fought with the Pharisees and with the Sadducees and with the pagans around him, right? And the apostles fought with pagans. We're fighting for our souls in this struggle to show that our God is mightier than all of these temptations and all of these bad habits. Second, of course, we have to fight a struggle in our families and in our churches for our youth. The numbers are not great for the retention of our youth in the Orthodox Church in the United States. There are some wonderful examples of camps and of other youth activities that are keeping people in the church. But I can see just anecdotally in my own parish that the people who are now leaders of the church don't necessarily have children in the church. And it's not that they're leaving in that old kind of casual way where they go to college and they go away from the church a little while and then they come back. They have been formed and shaped in their thinking by forces that are antithetical to the church, and they don't want the church. They're not just being a little bit immature and casually leaving in the expectation that when they have a family, they'll come back. They actively disregard or dislike what the church teaches. So we have to find some way to recognize that we're fighting a battle for the souls of our children. And we have to think of it that way. And that doesn't mean we have to be crazed and maniacal as we fight this battle, but we have to be deliberate and we have to be careful and we have to come up with actual realistic ways to maintain our children's faith in the church. The next thing I'd like to discuss is that notice there's a passive nature to the healing. The gifts of God are just that, gifts. When Jesus heals this woman, we read, "And when Jesus saw her, he called her and said to her, 'Woman, you are freed from your infirmity.' And he laid his hands upon her, and immediately she was made straight." She was a passive recipient of God's grace. And of course, we all know that God's grace is a gift to us. We don't earn it. We don't deserve it. We just have to respond to it. And this is something to consider because it's very easy for us somehow to imagine that when something good happens to us, that it makes us better people or people more worthy or more important or more significant than other people. The first thing we want to do when we encounter something spiritual or when we ourselves do something spiritual or generous, we go tell everyone. We brag about it. We share it instead of letting it grow slowly and quietly in our hearts so that it actually becomes spiritual power and strength. And this is a problem that St. Paul had in the Corinthian community, and which he addresses at great length throughout the first epistle to the Corinthians. He says to them in his thanksgiving, "I give thanks to God always for you because of the grace of God which was given you in Jesus Christ, that in every way you were enriched in him with all speech and all knowledge, even as the testimony to Christ was confirmed among you, so that you are not lacking in any spiritual gift as you wait for the revealing of our Lord Jesus Christ, who will sustain you to the end," right? The Corinthians were convinced that if they had some spiritual gift or some spiritual insight, that they had themselves become better people or more worthy people or better Christians than the Christian around them. And notice that throughout this section of the Thanksgiving, where Paul is thanking God for the Corinthians' gifts, he sees that there's a passive nature. These are passive verbs. The grace of God was given, right? You didn't take it, it was given. And you didn't enrich yourselves, you were enriched, passive. You received it, right? And the testimony of Christ was confirmed among you. And Christ is the one who will sustain you to the end, right? You were called into fellowship. The agency is entirely with God. The Corinthians just received it, right? And this is why later in 1 Corinthians 4, St. Paul says, "For who sees anything different in you? What have you that you did not receive? If you received it, why do you boast as if it were not a gift?" These are all gifts from God, and they don't give us an opportunity to brag or to put ourselves above other people, but they give us an opportunity to draw closer to God, right? So it's very important to recognize the passive nature of the gift. Because otherwise we're misusing the gift, and the gift will slowly wither in us if we don't use it properly. We're given these gifts from God not for any earthly power or any earthly standing or any earthly significance. God's gifts don't come to us to make us richer or more powerful in the world. God's gifts come to us to draw us closer to God, so that we take this heavenly gift in this world and we already enjoy the heavenly life. But very often we take the gifts of God and we use them for this world, and what that does is make them wither and die. They're misused. The heavenly gifts are not for here and now. They're to show us that the here and now should already be heavenly, right? And to use them for any kind of self-aggrandizement or anything like that is to misuse them. Next, we need to talk about the fact, and we kind of touched about this a little bit earlier when we talked about the Pharisees and their devotion to the strictest interpretation of the law and to the addition of other traditions to the law. And we see Christ here healing on the Sabbath, which means that somehow he's relaxing the law and he's relaxing Sabbath rules as though we don't need to follow rules anymore. And the question isn't quite that. And here we'll turn to the Gospel of Matthew, where in Matthew 5:17, Christ says, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." That's a very different thing. In other words, the law and the prophets had a purpose. And when Christ arrives, it doesn't mean that they are over. It means now that their original purpose is fully understood. And we see what that means when we go just a few verses later to Matthew 5:25 and following, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the men of old, 'You shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Make friends quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out till you have paid the last penny." The point of this is, it's no longer enough just to follow a basic rule about not committing murder. Now, it's not only that we don't commit murder, we don't become angry and enraged with people. It's a much deeper and more fulfilled notion of the law. The law was actually a little bit easier to follow, right? So it's not that Jesus is relaxing the commandments, he's intensifying them. The law was easy. All you had to do was not kill anyone. But you could be as angry as you wanted. You could insult them as much as you wanted. But now you can't be angry with them. You can't insult them. It internalizes the law, right? It's as though, when a child is very young, we tell them, you can never cross the street. You never cross the street. And so it's very easy for the child. He walks up to the sidewalk and stops, and he knows he should never cross the street. But after that, life gets more complicated because as a child grows up and is expected to become a much more mature thinking agent, now the child has to figure out when to cross the street. Now the child as a teenager or an adult can cross the street, but now life gets complicated. Now you have to look both ways. You have to understand how fast cars are going, and you have to decide whether it's safe. That's a mature adult person. And what Christ is doing here is making us much more mature in our understanding of God, what God wants for us. The law was there at a very primitive stage in the history of God's people to just make sure that they didn't kill. But now, as we become more mature, it's even harder. It's more complicated. Now we have to fight against anger, right? Because we are not just people who don't follow rules anymore. Jesus tells us a lot of things to do, like we just saw. And he tells us about those rules. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat upon that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So Jesus has given us things to do. Those are the things now that we have to do, but they're not so easy as a set of rules. Do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. They are be this and don't be that. It's a much more complicated and deeper understanding. And finally, just to emphasize again that we haven't relaxed all the rules, but we actually have new and more profound rules. At the end of the Gospel of Matthew in the Great Commission, we read, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you.'" There are commands from Jesus. It's not as though there are no rules anymore, right? I've made the point clear. I just wanted to make it as extensively as possible. The difference is that now the rules aren't just what we do. The rules are how we direct our entire lives. They're how we think. It goes into a much more profound and deep level within us. Finally, we have to address this issue about the prohibitions in the Jewish law against healing on the Sabbath. We read in our passage, "The ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, 'There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day.'" The collection of Jewish rules about legal activity and illegal activity, according to following the law of Israel, are collected in the early medieval period in the Talmud, and we refer to the Talmud, but there are actually really 2 Talmuds, and one is a little bit earlier and one a little bit later and more complete. But we'll just refer in the offhand way to the Talmud, because it has a collection of all the rabbinic decisions about how to follow the rules carefully. And in the section on the rules for the Sabbath and on how to avoid work, we see things like this. As Rabbi Zerah said, sometimes he said it in the name of Rav Matana, and sometimes he said it in the name of Mar Ukva, and they both said it in the name of Shmuel's father and in the name of Levi. One of them said, "With regard to placing wine inside the eye on Shabbat, it is prohibited because it heals. On the eye, it is permitted." And on one of them said, "Bland saliva, saliva from one who has not eaten since waking, even placing it on the eye on Shabbat is prohibited because it is commonly used as medicine." Right? Elsewhere, "It should be prohibited to stand a sick person in water to cool him off due to the rabbinic prohibition against engaging in healing on Shabbat." The Gemara answers, "In the case of a person, it appears as if he entered the water merely to cool off, not necessarily to cure an illness." So if someone just walks in the water to cool off, that's okay. That's not work because it's not healing. But if you put them in the water that's cool, perhaps to break a fever, to heal them, that's work. And you are not allowed to do the work of healing on the Sabbath. And so you can see how this is the sort of thing that is building among the Pharisees during the time of Jesus. And you can see the minute attention to the details where they're so concerned with following God's rules, they're behaving in ways that are incredibly inhumane. And that's what Jesus is opposing, right? The Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath was there as a gift to us. We were not made for the Sabbath, right? That's the first point. So the first point is that God has come to heal us, and the rules of the law are not that meant there to keep us sicker, but should be used in a way that heals us, not makes us sicker, and not in a way that is inhumane to people and cruel to people. But more important, Jesus is the one who decides what is and isn't done on the Sabbath. In John 5:18, Jesus has healed the man at the pool in Bethsaida on the Sabbath. And it says, "For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God." What Jesus said here is, My Father is still working, and I am still working. They said to him, how can you heal on the Sabbath? And he says, my Father is still working, and I am working. And what he means by that is, my Father works on the Sabbath because people are born and they die on the Sabbath. So God must be doing something. He's creating and taking life. And if the Father works on the Sabbath to give and take life, so do I. So this is not just some mundane comment where he's saying, well, God is the Father to all of us. And if God, who is the Father to all of us, heals on the Sabbath, then all of us can. Well, Jews obviously don't believe that. What he's saying is something far more profound. He is saying God the Father heals on the Sabbath. And since I am the Son of God, I will do as God the Father does. And here we see that this is what he means because we have this rabbinic comment from the rabbinic comment on Genesis that says, God rested from work on his world, but he did not rest from his work on the wicked and the righteous. That's because people are born and die, right? He did not rest from his work on the rich and the righteous, wicked and the righteous. He works with both. He shows to these something of their reward and to those something of their punishment. In other words, God may have stopped working on creation and rested, but he's obviously still in charge of bringing people to life and taking them out of life. And if that's the case, Jesus is claiming that same divine prerogative. So we see here two things in his insistence that he heals on the Sabbath. One is that he has come to heal people, not to injure them in the service of the law. But second, he's telling us that the law comes from God, and because he is God, he will determine what he does on the Sabbath and what he doesn't do on the Sabbath. So with that, fathers, we are finished for the day, and I wish you all the best in preaching on this wonderful passage.
Christe,